The first time an investigator stood in that quiet house, something immediately felt off. Not the kind of quiet you expect in a peaceful suburb, but the quiet that makes you wonder if the world has stopped just for a moment. It was early August 1984 in the Melbourne suburb of Ferntree Gully, Australia, a place where families walked dogs and children played after school, and yet inside one of its modest homes, a silence awaited that no one could explain. A single mother and her 9-year-old daughter lived on Kelvin Drive. They kept routines, saw neighbors, answered doors, and went about ordinary life. But on the morning of 7 August, the front door didn't open. No footsteps on the lawn, no voices to answer a simple knock. When someone finally entered, they discovered 2 lives had been taken in the night. They were found where they should have still been alive, in their beds. Nothing appeared forced, nothing seemed stolen. The unanswered questions came first. How could someone enter a home quietly, without being seen, and leave no trace that led anywhere? Investigators gathered what evidence they could: a footprint from a common shoe, a few clues buried in layers of uncertainty, and later forensic leads that briefly gave hope before collapsing due to contamination errors in the lab. This is a story of normal life interrupted, questions unfulfilled, and a search for truth that has outlasted the urgency of the first days. Before the headlines, before the investigation, there was a family with routines that seemed ordinary to everyone who knew them. Margaret Tapp worked to provide for her daughter, balancing shifts and errands with the quiet precision of someone who cared deeply about stability. People in the neighborhood described her as steady, private, and protective, the sort of person who knew her neighbors by name but kept most of her thoughts to herself. Those who crossed paths with her at the local shops or walking to the bus stop saw a woman who seemed as rooted in everyday life as anyone else. Her daughter, Shauna, was 9 years old. She was old enough to carry a book bag home from school filled with homework, but still young enough to glance back over her shoulder when she crossed the street, just to be sure someone she trusted was still there. Teachers remembered her quiet curiosity, how she asked thoughtful questions, and how she smiled easily when she understood something new. She had routines too: lunchboxes packed with care, sneakers left by the door at night, and a favorite bedtime story that marked the end of each day. Mornings for them were structured. Margaret would rise early, prepare breakfast for herself and Shauna, and make sure everything was ready for the day. Evenings were filled with dinner, tidying up, and the gentle predictability of homework, followed by a bedtime that came without complaint. That predictability was not born of monotony, it was born of love, a way of making the world feel safe, consistent, dependable. On the night of August 7th, 1984, nothing out of the ordinary was reported by neighbors. No raised voices, no sounds that drew eyes to the windows, no unexpected visitors arriving late. In a street where dogs barked and children sometimes raced bicycles up the driveway, that night passed without anything that, at the time, seemed remarkable. When someone entered that house the next morning, the ordinary was gone. The familiar warmth of a family home was replaced by stillness. The beds where Margaret and Shauna should have been waking up to start the day held a quiet that was too complete. Nothing in the physical space suggested violence against the structure itself. No doors forced, no windows broken, no furniture overturned. The calm was unsettling, not because it was silent, but because it was uncompromised by disruption. Investigators noted that everything appeared controlled, as though the presence of another person had not been detected. That contrast, the ease of their routines and the abrupt and unexplained end to them, became one of the most haunting aspects of the case. There were no preparations for school that morning, no briefcase set by the door, no unanswered telephone calls recorded on machines that had just entered many homes. Instead, the sequence of daily life had stopped. The rhythm that had defined ordinary moments for mother and daughter simply ended. Police arrived with urgency. This was not treated as a conundrum to be pondered, but as a crime to be solved. In 1984, in the outer Melbourne suburb of Ferntree Gully, investigators approached the scene of Margaret and Seana Tapp's home with the expectation that answers could be uncovered swiftly. The doorway was quiet, the neighborhood undisturbed, and at first glance, nothing in the physical environment indicated a struggle to the point of creating suspicion far beyond missing persons concern. So they worked under the assumption that the answers were close at hand. In most cases, they usually are. The first detail that commanded attention was the absence of forced entry. Doors stood as they should have, locks undisturbed, windows were intact. No shouts had been heard the previous night. No neighbor had noticed lights on in unusual hours. This singular detail, that someone accessed the house without overt signs of break-in, narrowed the investigative field quickly. Detectives asked themselves basic questions that soon carried weightier implications. Who had access? Who knew the layout of the home? Who could walk into the house and leave without being spotted or challenged? Early investigative theories centered on familiarity rather than random intrusion. A crime this controlled suggested someone the victims might not have feared. Statements were taken from neighbors and friends, each voice weaving fragments of routine into the tapestry of that final night. Officers canvassed the street, walked the lawns and driveways, questioned passers-by, and checked vehicles parked in driveways and along the curb. In metropolitan police work, mundane details often yield critical threads. Here, these threads were too fine to grasp firmly. Then came the details that deepened the horror. When the state of the bodies was examined more fully, it emerged that both Margaret and Seana had been assaulted before they were killed. In Seana's case, forensic examination confirmed sexual assault, a fact that shifted the tenor of the investigation. No longer was this simply a mystery of access and identity, but one of motive, violence, and profoundly disturbing intent. Detectives now had to confront the chilling possibility that the offender had entered the home with specific purpose, knowing the occupants and calculating the risk of discovery. One tangible piece of evidence did appear, a footprint impression from a Dunlop volley sand shoe, a style of shoe common at the time. Unremarkable in isolation, the print was nevertheless recorded meticulously, catalogued and measured. Though many Australians own similar footwear, the print offered something physical, a piece that could, with luck, be matched to a person or at least eliminated from suspicion. For a moment, that footprint represented a thread investigators could hold. Hope still existed, but time began to stretch. Witness accounts offered conflicting details. Some neighbors recalled nothing out of the ordinary. Others remembered cars driving past at odd hours. No one reported seeing someone enter or exit the house in the hours before the discovery. No clear suspect emerged. Days became weeks, weeks turned to months, and the early certainty that this case could be pieced together gave way to mounting complexity. Years later, in 2008, modern forensic testing appeared poised to offer a breakthrough. DNA found on Seana's nightgown was analyzed using techniques that had not existed in 1984. The result appeared to match a man already known to police. For the first time in decades, it seemed as though the case might finally move forward. Charges were laid, and public attention once again focused on a resolution. But within weeks, everything collapsed. It was discovered that the DNA sample had been contaminated in the laboratory. The genetic material had not originated from the crime scene at all, but had been inadvertently transferred from an unrelated case handled by the same facility. The contamination was not a subtle error, it was a fundamental flaw that invalidated the entire lead. The charges were withdrawn. What should have been a turning point became a setback, one that permanently damaged confidence in the strength of available evidence. And after that, the leads stopped. The urgency that had propelled the earliest days of the inquiry diminished, and with it, the sense that definitive answers were near. Yet many questions remain unresolved, and investigators continue to wonder whether something crucial had been overlooked in those earliest hours. Cold cases don't freeze all at once. They cool gradually. Phone calls slow, media attention drifts, investigators are reassigned to other matters, and everyday life resumes in places where nothing once felt ordinary. Days become weeks, weeks become months, months become years. Witnesses age, memories soften, evidence that once felt tangible begins to blur. In the quiet passage of time, the urgency of discovery can fade, but for the families caught in the center of unanswered questions, time doesn't heal, it suspends. For those closest to Margaret and Seana Tapp, the passage of years did not diminish the weight of the unanswered. Instead, it created a persistent stillness, a rhythm built not on resolution but on absence. Friends and neighbors moved forward with their lives, but never left that night behind. The street returned to its familiar routines. The trees shed their leaves season after season, and the sun rose on Ferntree Gully mornings much as it always had. Yet, beneath that surface calm lay the knowledge that two people had vanished from the sequence of daily life, and that no definitive explanation had been found. In the early years, the investigation had been active and intense, driven by leads and forensic developments. But after the collapse of the 2008 DNA evidence due to laboratory contamination, the momentum stalled. Instead of answering questions, the breakthrough raised new doubts, and the trail cooled. Investigators who once paced the rooms of the Tapp residence searching for clues found themselves moving on to other cases. New detectives reviewed the file later, scanning old reports and photographic plates with fresh eyes, but found no new leads to follow. Families who once held out hope that answers were around the corner learned how hope can recede into memory without closure. One detail remained unresolved above all others: how someone gained access to the home without force, without detection, and departed without ever being seen. That unanswered question became a hallmark of the case, not merely a puzzle piece, but a persistent echo. Years later, those who reviewed the case still returned to that point, as if solving that single element might unlock everything else. Yet no explanation ever fully accounted for it. Public reminders of the case became rare. Newspaper stories faded from the front pages. Television programs that once featured the Tapp murders as a compelling mystery shifted to newer headlines. Still, in 2017, renewed attention sparked when Victoria Police offered a substantial reward for information leading to a conviction. The announcement brought the case momentary focus once again, but tangible leads did not follow. The award emphasized that the case was not forgotten, even as the years widened the distance between the crime and the present. For the community, the passage of time did not soften the shock so much as transform it into a quiet conviction that life can continue outwardly even when questions remain unanswered inwardly. Evidence that once seemed promising, the footprint impression, the early forensic analysis, now exists primarily in archived files and photographic records. Memoranda are stored with careful notation, waiting for new technology or a fresh perspective to make sense of what was once incomprehensible. Cold cases do not end, they transform into something else, a ledger of what was lost and what remains unresolved. With no resolution, theories began to form, cautiously, deliberately, often in places where certainty had long since faded. In the early days after the murders of Margaret and Seana Tapp, investigators and observers alike faced a truth that few cases ever confront so starkly. They had detailed evidence, but none that pointed clearly to a suspect. In the absence of answers, speculation spread naturally, not out of sensationalism, but out of a need to explain what had happened in that quiet suburban home. One of the earliest and most persistent theories is rooted in familiarity. Some believe the offender was someone Margaret knew, someone trusted enough not to alarm her, someone whose presence in the house might not have been questioned. In cases with no signs of forced entry, law enforcement often considers the possibility that the perpetrator had legitimate access, whether through acquaintance, friendship, or an everyday connection. In the Tapp case, the lack of forced entry became one of the most discussed aspects, precisely because it suggested a level of ease that strangers rarely possess. For many, that detail alone has always felt too significant to ignore. Others have questioned the nature of the crime itself. Was it targeted, a deliberate act against this particular family, or opportunistic, carried out by someone who seized a moment they did not intend to fully understand? The answer to that question would influence the entire investigative approach, yet it remains unresolved. Theories of motive vary widely because no forensic or testimonial evidence ever produced a definitive reason for the attack. The house's faulty back door lock became another focal point. Investigators examined whether the offender took advantage of that weakness, not by accident, but by pre-existing knowledge. If someone already knew that the lock did not offer reliable security, they would have been able to enter without forcible signs. That small architectural flaw, a detail easily overlooked in everyday life, became, in theory, a clue to someone familiar with the house's rhythms and vulnerabilities. Another line of speculation centers on the idea that the perpetrator might have been someone who blended into normal life so completely that suspicion never stuck. In every community, residents move through routines. People exchange greetings, borrow items, share casual conversations. Someone who seemed ordinary might have left no trace of anything unusual in how they interacted with neighbors or friends. This theory does not specify who that person would be, but it underscores the reality that evil is often unremarkable on the surface, hiding in plain view. Then there's the evidence that failed to provide clarity. Could earlier forensic handling have preserved answers that are now lost? The contamination of the DNA sample in 2008 was one of the most dramatic twists in the history of this case. What appeared to be a breakthrough turned into a cautionary tale about laboratory errors. It raised questions about what might have been discovered if the evidence had been handled or stored differently. Was the footprint, the Dunlop Valley sand shoe impression, overlooked too quickly because it seemed ordinary? Because so many people wore similar shoes, it never yielded a distinct lead. But the fact that such tangible evidence did not produce a suspect continues to haunt those who revisit the case. Timing also fuels speculation. Why that night? Why that house? Investigators have returned repeatedly to these questions, not as simple curiosities, but as puzzles still in need of explanation. Some believe early assumptions narrowed the field too fast, focusing attention on familiar theories at the expense of less obvious possibilities. Others wonder whether the absence of forced entry created tunnel vision, causing investigators to look only at a subset of potential suspects, while disregarding others. No theory has ever been proven, and none can be dismissed entirely. That is the tension at the heart of unsolved cases, the unresolved possibilities that occupy the space between evidence and uncertainty. They do not conclude, they invite participation. For people who follow these stories, whether lifelong residents of a community or viewers halfway around the world, the absence of answers becomes a canvas on which imagination and inquiry meet. In cases like this, the audience becomes part of the search, not as judge, jury, or accuser, but as witness to unanswered questions that persist against the passage of time. Each theory may falter in proof, yet each one keeps alive the hope that one day a new piece of information or a fresh interpretation of old evidence could finally illuminate what happened that cold morning when normal life simply ended. There is a unique cruelty to unsolved crimes. They don't end. They repeat through anniversaries and quiet moments when normal life resumes for everyone else. But for those closest to the victims, the absence of closure becomes its own kind of burden. Grief in these circumstances does not transform into a gentle acceptance. It stalls, suspended in a loop of unanswered questions and lingering what-ifs. For the family and friends of Margaret and Seana Tapp, more than 40 decades on, the passage of time has not eased the weight of that night. It has merely made the silence feel longer. Every new lead in the case revived hope. When forensic science appeared to offer a breakthrough decades later, there was a momentary surge of optimism that the truth might finally emerge. That hope was powerful enough to circulate through community groups, letters to police, and media reminders about the reward later offered by Victoria Police for information that could lead to a conviction. The possibility of resolution felt like a lifeline, something to cling to after so many years of waiting. But when that lead collapsed due to evidence contamination in the laboratory, it was not just an investigative setback. It became a reminder that the answers might always lie just beyond reach. Every dead end compounded exhaustion. The families who lived with the unanswered questions did not have the luxury of stepping away from the case when investigators moved on. They carried the uncertainty into their daily lives, into birthdays, into anniversaries, into moments that should have been ordinary, but were instead underscored by what had been lost. The absence of answers turned into a form of punishment that outlasted the violence itself, a lifetime marked by speculation rather than certainty. Communities move on, but they don't forget. Neighbors change, children grow up, and suburban streets return to their routines. The house on Kelvin Drive, once the scene of questions without answers, becomes just another address in a quiet neighborhood. Yet memory lingers longer than architecture. For those who knew Margaret and Seana, their presence persists in recollection of school habits, shared conversations, and the ordinary rhythms of life that were never meant to be interrupted. In unsolved cases, silence carries more weight than any conclusion ever could. It becomes not just a lack of answer, but a presence in itself, a reminder that some questions remain open, even as the world continues. We began with silence, and decades later, that silence remains. The murders of Margaret and Seana Tapp were never solved, not because no one cared, but because the search for truth proved fragile in the face of faded leads and elusive answers. Evidence that once held promise slipped through the cracks of time. Forensic breakthroughs that seemed near evaporated when contamination undermined their value. And as years passed, certainty, the thing every investigation strives for, slipped further from reach. Today, the case remains officially open. Victoria Police continues to seek information from anyone with knowledge that might shed light on what happened in that quiet Ferntree Gully home in August 1984. A substantial reward, publicly offered in recent years to encourage new leads, still stands for information that could lead to a conviction. But beyond resolution lies remembrance. This story is not about rekindling old pain. It's about refusing to let those lives be forgotten. Margaret and Seana were more than names on a cold case file. They were people with routines, relationships, and futures that were never fully lived. Their absence shaped more than the night it occurred. It shaped every unanswered question that followed. So the question returns, not as accusation, but reflection. What piece of this puzzle might someone still hold? Could this case still be solved with new information or fresh eyes? And how many stories like this are still waiting, quietly, for someone to listen once more? If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below with your thoughts. Do you think this case could still be solved? What do you think was missed? Your engagement helps bring these stories to more people who might hold the missing piece to the puzzle.